One of the big flaws with how we're taught to write in schools is how much focus is placed on grammar, even when we're writing short stories. In my creative writing class that I'm taking, I've learned about appositive phrases and this grammar function and that grammar function early on in the year is part of the basics of writing. And this is just a really bad way to go about focusing on writing. The vast majority of readers have no clue what inappositive phrases. They barely know what a comma is. Come on, we're talking about Americans. We're not such deep, insightful readers as this, folks. In large part because of this, and because of a desire to be writing a proper story, one that's well-written, and sort of a more school-given definition of what a well-written story is, which also comes along with, how they say every story needs to have a beginning, a middle, an end, and then, climax, falling action, resolution. Schools kind of push a lot of things on us that not every high-level, well-written story does. However, if you read a lot of stories from best-selling authors, from authors who genuinely have skill, which aren't always best-selling, and the best-selling authors don't always have skill, but generally there's some overlap. Generally, you read any successful book, the grammar is actually not as good as even some of the writing I've seen from very amateurish, unskilled writers in my English class, for example. This isn't because best-selling authors simply don't understand the grammar rules, it's because they're purposefully ignoring them. Because at the end of the day, the important thing to remember is that actual people don't talk in perfect grammatical sentences. But not only that, they don't think in perfect grammatical sentences. They don't describe things to others in dialogue, or to themselves even, in perfect grammatical sentences. So you can have a character looking around the room, and you can have ungrammatical sentences about how things are laid out. You can have ungrammatical thoughts. Especially, you can have ungrammatical speech, where people are interrupting each other and even interrupting themselves. That's something that differentiates the writing, I think, of a lot of amateurs from a lot of pros, is that pros tend to write plenty of times characters who interrupt themselves, who go, hey, blah, 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 blah. Oh, actually, because people do pause and, think things through as they're saying them. Not everybody, sits down, plans out every sentence, and then says it. That's just not how people are. But, a lot of amateur writers write as if, not even necessarily that every character is professorial exactly, but that they've completely thought through what they're going to say. And most people open their mouth long before they've thought through what they're going to say. Of course, grammar and sentence structure is not completely left by the wayside. I wish I didn't have to go through, yes, I know that I'm not saying blah, blah, blah. But every single YouTuber has to do this. If you tell people to stay warm, they're like, what? So you're telling us to set ourselves on fire? So in every YouTube video, you have to say, no, I'm not telling you to set yourself on fire. This is what it's like being a YouTuber. But anyways, I'm not saying completely disregard every rule of grammar. No successful writer does that. But they only are loyal specifically to rules of grammar to the extent that it improves the story and makes things easier to understand. And grammar rules go as far deep as they are because that's technically more understandable. Stuff that's grammatically perfect is very easy to understand, unless it's very professorial, which a lot of grammatically perfect things are, because only professors write that way, because that's not how normal people communicate. But normal people understand very ungrammatical sentences. Black people black people talk differently? Yes, African American Vernacular English, AAVE, it's a real thing, stop flaming me. They'll say, you crazy. Do you not know what that means? It's grammatically crap, but that is perfectly understandable. Nobody's gonna hear that and be like, what? There's no R in there. What on earth is this person trying to say? I would say that as a rule of thumb, you should be loyal to grammar rules and conventions to the extent that it makes your sentences understandable. Because if you have absolutely no grammar at all, nobody will know what you're talking about. At the point where people know easily what you're talking about. For example, high-level authors, you read their dialogue where characters are interrupting each other or they're interrupting themselves. It's not all grammatically perfect. You can pretty much guess what the character more or less would be saying if they had said that whole sentence and hadn't chopped things off when they jumped to a new thought. But they don't need to show that because you as the reader know what the character is trying to communicate and what they're going through as they're, chopping off their thoughts and jumping to the next ones. You can understand things as a reader that are very, very far from grammatically perfect. And while, your English teacher may care about your grammar, Your professor or your this or that may care about your grammar. The critics are going to care about your grammar. Readers do not give a crap. Readers give a crap about understanding what you're trying to communicate. And what you're trying to communicate may be communicated better through things that aren't grammatically perfect. Not just the dialogue that a character says, a character's thoughts. And yes, even people who think in big words and are very professorial, not even them, they don't think in perfectly grammatical sentences. Like, almost nobody does. Almost nobody goes into a room and is like, oh, there is a lamp sitting there looking majestically. Like, people don't think in that way. So at the end of the day, while grammar is important so that you can be understood, beyond the point at which readers will understand you, the way you're trying to tell your story and the story itself that you're trying to tell is always more important.